Hey guys, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 27 called A Visit to the Races. Now this chapter has some new vocab, but there's really no set vocab list for this chapter, so we're going to skip the derivatives for now. Instead, we're going to stay focused on the grammar because this chapter has 4 really big pieces of grammar that we need to take apart individually to understand them. So this is a very grammar heavy chapter. The first grammar we want to look at is looking at the dative case again. And we're going to look at the dative case with special intransitive verbs, which is something we've actually seen before, but we're going to add to our list. So just a quick recap. You might remember back in chapter 24, we learned that some intransitive verbs take the dative case to complete their meaning. So for instance, if you had jam urbi apropinquabant, we would translate this, already they were approaching the city. The word urbi is dative, and we learned that apropinquare always takes a dative. So technically that says now they were approaching to the city, but we would just translate it, they were approaching the city. That's how you'd want to translate it. There are actually a few more verbs that we want to add to that list that always take a dative. They include nocere, which means to harm, or literally to do harm to, confidere, which means to give trust to, or another way to translate it is to trust, and favere, which means to give favor to. All of these verbs are going to be using the dative case, and that's why in parentheses they have the word to after their meaning. It's trying to tell you that they're going to have the dative going with them. So just to give you a few examples, if you had fratri Tito non confido, we would translate that, I do not give trust to my brother Titus. The real way we want to translate it though, that's a little less literal, would say, I do not trust my brother Titus. We have our verb confido, which we know always takes the dative. And we have the dative nouns, fratri Tito, my brother Titus. So if you take a look at this, you can see how when you have confido, it's going to take the dative. Fratri and Tito are both in the dative case. The next piece of grammar we want to talk about are pronouns, and we're going to do a lot with pronouns in this chapter. The first piece we want to look at are first and second person pronouns. So just to recap, you want to remember that in Latin and in English, pronouns are words that are used in place of nouns. It comes from the Latin word pronomen, which literally means in the place of a noun. Throughout the first 26 chapters of Ecce Romani, you've actually seen various forms of Latin pronouns. In this chapter, we're going to look specifically at the first and second person pronouns, which in English are I, me, we, us, you, and you all. So let's start with first person pronouns. You want to remember that the first person refers to the speaker in either the singular, which would be I or me, or in the plural, we or us. In Latin, pronouns have cases, so you need to use the appropriate case when you're translating the sentence. So here's what the chart looks like for all the first person pronouns. Now this should look pretty familiar to you because you've seen these Latin words before and you've known how to translate them for a while now. We just have never seen them all together in one chart. But you want to remember the nominative ego means I, and if you go down the list you can translate the English of me, to or for me, and by with from me. When you put it in the plural you just change I to we and me to us. So you have we, of us, to or for us, and by with from us. Again, this is just memorization so that you know what these forms are and how we use them. So one quick note is that the genitive form of first and second person pronouns is pretty limited in its use. They're not used to show possession, and that's an important note to take. When you want to show possession with pronouns, we use the possessive adjective, which we're going to cover later on in this video. So here are some examples of first person pronouns in Latin. In this sentence, we have sed ego volo consulere Marcum, which means, but I want to consult Marcus. It's a line from earlier on in one of the first chapters of the book. Next, we have nihil me terret, and nobis necesse est statum descedere. Now, if we look at the first sentence, sed ego volo consulere Marcum, you can see the word ego there, and we translate it I. It's the nominative form of the first person pronoun. If you look at the second sentence, you'll see me, which means me, and in this case it's the accusative. You're saying nothing frightens me. In the third sentence we have nobis, which means for us. And again, you can see how we translate it. It's necessary for us to leave immediately. The next type of pronoun we want to look at is the second person pronoun. And again, you want to remember that the second person refers to the person being spoken to by the speaker. So in other words, it's not the speaker, it's the person that they are speaking to. In the singular, we translate this you, and in the plural, we're talking about you all. Here's the chart of second person pronouns. And again, you're going to recognize these hopefully right away because you've seen them before. Words like to, tui, tibi, te, te, they translate in English into you, of you, to or for you, and by, with, from you. And again, if you look at the plural column, all we're doing is changing the you to you all. So here are some examples of second person pronouns in Latin sentences. First, we have Marque, cur tu arborem non ascendis, which means Marcus, why did you not climb the tree? Next, we have quid te terret. And finally, we have servi mei bonam cenam vobis statim parare possunt, which means my slaves are able to prepare a good dinner for you immediately. So if we look at the first sentence, you can see the word to there is the pronoun. And again, it's the nominative in this case. He's saying, Marcus, why do you not climb the tree? It's the subject of the verb ascendis. In the second sentence, we have te, which is the accusative. He's asking, what frightens you? It's the direct object. In the third sentence, we have vobis, which means for you. This is the dative. It's saying, I could prepare a good meal for you immediately. This is from the chapter where the family visits the inn. Here's a chart of all the first and second person pronouns together. Now, you want to memorize these, but there are a few tricks that might help you out. So first off, you'll notice that in the accusative and ablative, the spelling is almost identical for first person and second person. You're just swapping out an M in the first person with a T in the second person, which makes sense. We've seen the words may and te before. You just flip the M with a T and they're spelled the exact same way. The plural side of the chart is really where you can see the pattern though. If you go down the line for first person and second person pronouns, you're going to see they're spelled basically the exact same way. All you've done is you've taken the N, which is the letter we use for the first person side, and you flipped it with a V, which is how we spell the second person pronouns. So if you can memorize the plurals together, it'll really help you out to just remember that there's an N for first person and a V for second person. Here's one last thought that might help you know when you should use these pronouns. You want to remember that the Romans only used the nominative form of pronouns to provide emphasis or to really stress the subject. So more often we don't see pronouns being used as subjects because the verb ending tells you who the subject is. So there's no need for a pronoun. Here are a few examples for you. If I wrote eis epistulam mitam, I'm saying I will send a letter to them. You know that the subject is I because of the ending am in mitam. That means I will send. If I wanted to put a pronoun, though, I would use the pronoun ego, which means I. So in this case, if I wrote ego eis epistulam mitam, I'm saying I will send the letter to them. And if I had a second half of the sentence that said quid tu mites, I'm saying what will you send? In this case, both pronouns are there for emphasis. I don't actually need them. They're just emphasizing the point. So when you translate this, you're really saying, I am the one who will send the letter. What will you send? You're kind of emphasizing those two words. If I got rid of the pronouns ego and tu, my sentence would mean the exact same thing. Next, we want to take a look at third-person pronouns. Now, you might be wondering why we have them in a different category. It's because the endings are pretty different, so they stand alone in your book and in this video. So you want to remember, the third person refers to persons or things that the speaker is talking about. And in English, we use he or him, she, her, it, its, they, or them. The one difference with third-person pronouns is that they have gender. So that might be something you noticed. For first and second person, there's no gender associated with the pronouns. In third person, there is. So here's the chart for third person pronouns. And you'll notice this is the masculine chart. And the forms are pretty different from first and second person, which is why third person stands on its own. You might recognize some of them though. And we've seen, for instance, the genitive singular of eos since some of the early chapters of this book. So some might look familiar, but you want to memorize them nonetheless. And again, pay attention to the way that we translate these in English. This is the feminine column. We've gone from he to she, him to her, and down the line. Here's the neuter chart. And again, you'll notice that we've changed our translations. Instead of he or she, now we have it, which makes sense. We're talking about neuter pronouns. If you put all three genders together in one chart, this is what you'd have. Now, at first look, this seems like a lot of endings, and it will take some memorization, but there is a pattern here that might help you out while you're studying it. So for instance, if you look at the accusative singular, you can see that the endings actually make a good amount of sense. In the masculine column, it's a um ending, which we've seen a lot for accusative singular. The same goes for the ablative singular. We have the long O there. On the feminine column, you can see the am for accusative singular. Again, that's an ending we've seen in first declension nouns for a long time. Same with the ablative with the long A. And again, if you look at nominative singular for feminine, there's also the short A there, which makes perfect sense. On the neuter column, one thing you want to remember is that nominative and accusative are always the exact same thing. So for third person pronouns, the nominative singular is id, and the accusative singular is id. If you look at the plural, we might remember that for neuter nouns, when you have plural forms, they're going to end in a. The same goes here for the pronouns. So you have ea, e short a, that's the nominative plural and the accusative plural for neuter nouns. If we look at all the plurals though, this is where memorizing third-person pronouns is actually fairly easy. The endings are the noun endings from first and second declension that you already know. So for example, on the masculine column, if you take the letter E, which is how they're all going to start, the endings go E, orum, is, os, is. For the feminine, it's I, orum, is, as, is. And for the neuter, it's a, orum, is, a, is. These are endings that we've seen throughout our whole time in the Ecce 1 textbook, so they should be pretty straightforward to memorize. So here are just a few basic notes to finish off this section of the video. You want to remember that third-person pronouns have endings similar to first and second declension adjectives, especially in the plural. Another note you want to remember is that the genitive is used to show possession. So we said for first and second person pronouns, it's not used for possession. For third person pronouns, it absolutely is. So you want to keep note of that and make sure that you know how to use it when you're translating. We've actually seen this throughout previous chapters. So for instance, the word eos we've seen to mean his, hers, or its. It's showing possession. So that shouldn't be too hard to remember for you. The last thing you want to remember is that since third-person pronouns use gender, the nominative singulars is and ea can actually refer to things. So if you see a thing, such as a dog, for instance, if you wanted to use a pronoun and say it, you could use is or ea. Now, the reason you'd use it there is because the word dog is either masculine or feminine. So even though it's talking about a thing, we would use either masculine or feminine depending on the gender of the noun. Here are a few examples for you. If we saw Flavia epistulam scribit, Cornelia eam legit, we would translate it, Flavia writes a letter, Cornelia reads it. The word eam is referring back to epistulam. Now, the word letter is technically a thing, but you want to remember that letter is feminine in Latin. So when we use the word it as the pronoun, it's spelled eam, it's the feminine accusative singular. Even though you're referring to a thing, the word epistulam is feminine, so we have to use the feminine form of the third person pronoun. This is where it gets a little weird because in your head you might be thinking that when you refer to things it's always neuter. That's not the case. You just want to remember to match the gender when you're dealing with pronouns. This brings us to the next section of the grammar, reflexive pronouns. Now this is just one more variant of the pronouns you just learned, but it's an important one, so you want to pay attention as we go. Reflexive pronouns are ones that refer back to the subject of a sentence. The term reflexive actually comes from Latin, reflecto, reflectere, which means to bend back. So in this case, you're kind of bending or looking back to the subject of the sentence when you're using a reflexive pronoun. Take a look at these sentences in English to get a sense of how these pronouns work. First, we have you praised me, you praised him, I praised myself, and Aurelia praised herself. The first two sets of pronouns are personal pronouns. You're saying you praised me. You're talking about one person praising another person. So we replace the noun with the pronoun me or him. This is what we just learned earlier in the video. The next two pronouns, though, are doing something different. They're not referring to another person. They're referring to the speaker itself. So in other words, in the first two sentences, you and me are two different people. You and him are two different people. I and myself are the same person, though. The same goes with Aurelia and herself. They're the same person. These are reflexive pronouns, and we call them that because the pronoun, in the first example, myself, is referring back to the subject, I. So there's a difference between saying I praised you and I praised myself. When I'm talking about myself, or the speaker is talking about his or herself, we use a reflexive pronoun. Reflexive pronouns refer to the subject of the sentence, they can't be the subject themselves. So in other words, there's no nominative case form of these pronouns. And if you think about it, that makes sense. You need a subject to refer back to. If the pronoun was the subject, it would have nothing to refer back to. So there is no nominative case form of reflexive pronouns. Other than this though, reflexive pronouns are pretty easy to understand because they have the same forms as first and second person personal pronouns. So instead of thinking of reflexive pronouns as their own type of pronoun, it's sometimes easier to think of them as just personal pronouns being used reflexively. So in other words, it's just another use of the pronouns you already know. So here's the chart of the first person reflexive pronouns. And again, you'll notice the forms are the exact same as first person personal pronouns. All we're doing here is using them reflexively. So for instance, and remember there's no nominative form here, but going down from genitive to ablative, we would translate them in English of myself, to or for myself, myself, by, with, from, myself. You can hear in the word myself in English, it's always referring back to the speaker. In the plural, all we do is change myself to ourselves, and it has the exact same meaning. The same goes for the second person reflexive pronouns. Here, the forms are the same as second person personal pronouns, but we use them reflexively. So we translate it of yourself, to or for yourself. And in the plural, we just change yourself to yourselves, but it means the same thing. Here's the chart of first and second person reflexive pronouns. And again, you'll notice that these are pretty easy to follow because they're the exact same as first and second person personal pronouns. So once you have one chart memorized, you'll know how reflexive works. It's just about what their function is in the sentence. They're referring back to the subject. That's the key difference. So you may have noticed that we didn't have third person reflexives in that chart. The reason why is because third person reflexive pronouns have different forms. They're pretty easy to recognize though, because they're the same as the second person except the T has been replaced with an S. So here's the chart for third person reflexive pronouns. Now one thing you'll probably notice is that the spelling is pretty close, like I said, to second person. So instead of tui, tibi, te, te, you have sui, sibi, se, se. But look at how the English works. We translate it of himself, herself, itself. The reason we do that is because there's no gender when we're talking about third person reflexive pronouns. There's not a different spelling for the different genders. It all depends on what noun the pronoun is referring to. So if you're referring to something that's masculine, you'd say of himself. Feminine would be of herself. Neuter would be of itself. It all depends on what you're referring to. The other interesting thing you'll notice is that the singular and plural are spelled the exact same way, and we'll explain why right now. So for third person reflexive pronouns, like we just said, the forms are identical in the singular and the plural. This might seem kind of confusing, but you have to remember that the pronouns agree with the subject in number. So for instance, if the subject is plural, the reflexive pronoun also has to be plural. If the subject is singular, the reflexive pronoun is also singular. Let's take a look at some examples. So to start, we have Cornelia de se cogitat, which means Cornelia thinks about herself. The reflexive pronoun here is se. It's referring to Cornelia, which means it's singular and it's feminine, so we translate it herself. If we have another example, pueri de se cogitan, you can see that we translate this, the boys think about themselves. The pronoun though, the reflexive pronoun, is still se. It's the exact same word we used in the previous example. In this case though, se is referring to pueri, which means boys. The word pueri is masculine plural, so we translate it themselves. If we look at the two sentences together, you can see what I'm talking about. The pronoun is the exact same for both. The reason why is they're both ablative singular. But the way we translate it depends on what we're referring back to. So in sentence 1, se refers to Cornelia, it's feminine singular, herself. In sentence 2, se refers to pueri, which is plural and masculine. So we translate it themselves. So again, even though it might be a little confusing at first, always figure out what word is say, or any third person reflexive pronoun. What word is it referring to? It's going to have the exact same gender and number. So another quick note. You want to remember that when the subject refers to another person or thing, we use a personal pronoun. When the subject refers to him, her, or itself, we use a reflexive pronoun. And that difference is critical because it can totally change the meaning of the sentence if you don't catch what thing or person the pronoun refers to. So let's take a look at some examples. These first two sentences are both using the pronoun te. In the first sentence, you have tu te laudavisti, which means you praised yourself. In the second sentence, we have Cornelius te laudavit. Cornelius praised you. They're doing two different things. In the first sentence, te refers to the subject, tu. You're praising yourself. This is a reflexive pronoun. In the second sentence, te is referring to Cornelius. So it's not saying Cornelius praised himself. That wouldn't make any sense. It's saying Cornelius praised you. In other words, in the first sentence, the subject is praising themselves. In the second sentence, the subject is praising someone else. That's the difference between the two uses of this pronoun. Let's take a look at two more examples. Here you have ego mihi epistulas scripsi, which means I wrote a letter to myself. In the second sentence, we have puer mihi epistulas scripsit, which means the boy wrote a letter to me. Again, the pronoun here is mihi. In the first sentence, you're saying, I wrote a letter to myself. The subject is the person writing the letter to himself. And that's why we're using a reflexive pronoun. In the second sentence, the subject is not writing a letter to himself. The boy is writing a letter to me. In other words, the subject is writing a letter to another person. These last two examples probably are the best way to think about how the difference is really important. If you look here, we have Aurelia se laudavit and Aurelia eam laudavit. Almost the exact same sentence. Se is a reflexive pronoun. You're saying Aurelia praised herself. The pronoun is referring back to the subject. In the second sentence, you have Aurelia eam laudavit. That just means Aurelia praised her. It's a personal pronoun. That difference in how we use the pronoun changes the meaning of the sentence. There's a huge difference between praising yourself and praising someone else. That's what the pronouns are all about. So you want to remember, if the subject is doing something back to itself, you're going to use a reflexive pronoun. If the subject is doing something to someone else or referencing someone else, you want to use a personal pronoun. You'll get used to the difference between the two of them, but make sure you have the use straight so that you know how we use these. Next, we're going to move on to possessive adjectives. And again, we referenced this earlier in the video, how we show possession. That's really what these adjectives are all about. So like we mentioned before, the genitive form of first and second person pronouns is not used to show possession. To do this, we use a possessive adjective instead. So one quick note. You want to remember that if you want to show possession in the third person, so in other words to say his, her, or its, you do use the genitive form of is, ea, id. The possessive adjectives are used in the first and second person. So in other words, how we say my, yours, ours, etc. So there's a difference there depending on what you're trying to say. For the third person, we use the genitive form of the personal pronoun. For the first and second person, we use possessive adjectives. So here's a quick example of possessive adjectives. If you said pecuniam meam, you're saying my money. We wouldn't say pecuniam mei, which might seem like the right answer, saying the money of me. That's not how it works. So in the first sentence, pecuniam meam, we're using the possessive adjective. In the second sentence, which we would not want to do, you're using a personal pronoun. There's a difference here. We've actually already seen possessive adjectives throughout the book. And they go like this. You've seen meus a to mean my, tuus to mean your, noster to mean our, and wester to mean your. What you want to notice is that these possessive adjectives are using the same endings as first and second declension adjectives. So that's why we have the us, a, ending on them. They're using endings that you're very familiar with. One new variant on this idea, though, is using a reflexive possessive adjective. So these have the same forms as normal possessive adjectives, but like we learned with pronouns, they act reflexively, meaning they refer back to the speaker. One thing you're going to notice is that for the first and second person, you don't really need to worry too much about your translation. It'll kind of take care of itself. So here's what I mean. If you had meam epistulam habes, it means you have my letter. In this case, the possessive adjective meam is not acting reflexively because it's not referring to the subject, which would be you. In the second sentence, though, we have meam epistulam habeo. Now you've changed the subject to I. This means that meam, if you're saying I have my letter, my is referring to the subject, I. It's reflexive. So what you're really saying is I have my own letter. If you translate it my, though, you're going to get the same idea. So there won't be too much confusion saying I have my letter. You don't really need to think too much about it being a reflexive adjective. It kind of makes sense on its own. For the third person, though, we do make a distinction between a personal pronoun in the genitive case, for instance, eos, which means his, and a reflexive possessive adjective, which would mean his own. So when you have a third person reflexive possessive, we use suus a So it's almost the same as meus or tuus, and again, we've seen the s used for third person. So suus a is following the same endings as a first and second declension adjective. So it's not that hard to figure out how we would spell these. It's more important to think about how we'd use them. So for example, if we had Marcus librum suum habet, it means Marcus has his own book. If we said Marcus librum eos habet, this means Marcus has his book, meaning someone else's book. The difference is between the possessive adjective and the personal pronoun. So in the first sentence, we're using the reflexive possessive adjective, suum. It's referring back to Marcus. So you're not saying Marcus has his book, you're really saying Marcus has his own book. In other words, he's the person who owns it. If we use eos, which is the personal pronoun in the genitive case, we're saying Marcus has his book, meaning someone else's book. The example I gave you here would be Sextus. So if I was trying to say Marcus has Sextus's book, I would use eos, his. And in English, it's hard to tell the difference here. The translation sounds exactly the same. Marcus has his book, Marcus has his book. That's why when we're using a reflexive, we would say his own book. It tells you that it belongs to the speaker, it belongs to the subject, Marcus. This is the key difference between possessive adjectives and personal pronouns in the genitive case. So you want to make sure that you're keeping those two straight. So again, when the object in question belongs to the speaker, we use a reflexive possessive, in this case suus a which means his, her, or its own. When the object in question belongs to someone other than the speaker, we use the personal pronoun in the genitive case, eos, which would mean his, her, or its. One last note I want to give you. For third-person possessives, we use the form suus a for the singular and the plural. Now this is the same concept we just learned for third-person reflexive pronouns. You remember sui, sibi, se. They can be either singular or plural. The key to understand this is that the subject of the sentence will always tell you if suus a is singular or plural. So in other words, if the subject is singular, the third-person possessive will be singular. If the subject is plural, then suus a will also be plural. So always start by looking at your subject. That'll tell you the answer. One last thought. This chapter is extremely grammar heavy, so there's a lot of different ideas going on. Some of them are pretty complicated. So be sure to take the time to learn all the pronouns individually and then see how they relate to each other as a whole. That's your best bet instead of trying to cover pronouns all together in one shot. Break them up into separate pieces, practice them, and then once you feel comfortable, start thinking about how they relate to each other. That's the best way to approach this chapter.